On a cold January morning in 1956, a radio DJ mocked a young singer from Memphis, calling him just another nobody with a wiggle. The next day, that same DJ's phone lines crashed, because what Elvis Presley did in response didn't just change one man's opinion, it changed music forever. Memphis, Tennessee, January 8th, 1956. The city hummed with jukeboxes and neon diner lights. Teenagers crowded around radios, waiting to hear the newest sound sweeping the South. Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. Inside WCHQ radio, the air smelled of coffee and hot wiring. Tommy Red Carson, a confident disc jockey with slicked hair and a loud laugh, leaned toward his microphone. He liked stirring people up. Controversy meant listeners. As the final notes of Heartbreak Hotel faded, he chuckled. "Well, folks," he said into the mic, "there's your boy Elvis Presley, a nobody from Tupelo trying a little too hard to be somebody. Guess hip-shaking sells better than talent these days." The line went out live. Across Tennessee, living rooms fell silent. Then phones started ringing, some laughing, some furious. In a small dressing room behind a local theatre, Elvis heard it too. His band was tuning up for that night's charity set when the insult came through the crackling radio. He froze. Scotty Moore, his guitarist, tried to laugh it off. "Don't listen, Elvis. He's just flapping his gums." But Elvis didn't speak. He just stared at the wall, jaw tight, foot tapping slow against the floor. Outside, rain began to fall, a soft, steady hiss like static. He finally said, "Maybe he's right. Maybe they still don't see me." No one answered. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them. Hours later, after the show, Elvis sat alone in his truck behind the venue. The dashboard radio replayed Carson's segment on loop. He listened to it twice, then turned it off. The only light came from the red glow of the heater vents across his knuckles. He whispered, "A nobody, huh? We'll see about that." Meanwhile, at WCHQ, Carson laughed with his producer. "Did you hear those calls? We're trending before trending exists." He didn't realize that by sunrise, his own name would be on the front page. For all the wrong reasons. Because word travels fast in Memphis. Fans told fans. Record stores replayed the broadcast on speakers. By midnight, half the city knew that a radio host had called the South's new star a nobody. One diner owner later said the jukebox was unplugged that night. Not out of protest, but because people wanted to listen to the rumor instead. Somewhere between anger and hurt, Elvis made a decision. He grabbed the phone on his nightstand and stared at the number for WCHQ. His finger hovered above the dial, then stopped. "Not yet," he smiled faintly. "Tomorrow morning will do. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's planning. Would you have called the man who insulted you, or let the world forget?" By dawn, the city would wake to more than gossip. It would wake to a moment that would turn a quiet insult into the birth of an icon. January 9th, 1956, 11:58 a.m. The phones at WCHQ radio were already ringing before the noon shift began. At first, the receptionist thought it was normal. A few upset fans complaining about the previous night's broadcast. But the calls didn't stop. They multiplied. 2 lines, then 4. Then all 10. "Is Carson there? Tell him Elvis ain't no nobody." One voice shouted. Another said, "You tell him the South's listening." By noon, the phone lights glowed like a Christmas tree. Even the station manager came running from his office, tie loose, eyes wide. "Red, what did you say on air last night?" Carson laughed, spinning in his chair. "Relax. A little jab never killed nobody." But the laughter faded when his producer handed him a note. Scrawled across it were 5 words that made him blink twice. "Elvis Presley is on line 1. Carson smirked, thinking it was a prank. "Sure he is," the producer whispered. "It's him." I recognized the voice. Carson grabbed the receiver, still trying to sound in control. "Well, if it isn't the king of hip shakes himself." On the other end came that slow, honeyed drawl. Calm, steady. "Mr. Carson," Elvis said. "I heard what you said last night." A pause, just static. Carson shifted in his seat. Ah, well, you know how radio goes. Gotta stir the pot. Elvis didn't take the bait. I understand. Maybe you'd let me come by, play a song, let the folks decide who's a nobody. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that made everyone in the booth stop pretending to work. The janitor paused mid-sweep. The switchboard operator froze. Carson finally said, "You serious?" "I'm always serious about music," Elvis replied. Even through the phone, you could hear his confidence. No anger, no sarcasm, just quiet certainty. Carson covered the mouthpiece and muttered, "If he shows up, the ratings will melt this city." He cleared his throat. "Fine, Presley. You've got yourself a deal. 7 p.m. live, one song." "Don't be late." When he hung up, the room erupted. "You're really going to let him on air?" the producer asked. "Why not?" Carson grinned. "Let's see if the kid can actually sing without a crowd screaming behind him." But word travels fast in Memphis, faster than any broadcast signal. By 3 o'clock, every record store in town was buzzing with the news. Elvis was going live on the same station that mocked him. People crowded around storefront radios. Diner owners wrote "Tune in at 7" on their chalkboards. Even soldiers at the nearby base asked for early leave to listen. Meanwhile, Elvis sat in his tiny rented room, strumming quietly on his Martin D18 guitar. His manager, Colonel Parker, paced behind him. "You sure about this, son? You could ignore it and move on." Elvis shook his head. "Sometimes you don't move on, you move through." Outside, the sun began to set. Streetlights flickered on. At 6:45 p.m., a line of fans already stood outside the WCHQ glass windows. Some held signs. Others just wanted to see the face behind the voice. Inside, Carson adjusted his tie, hiding nerves behind bravado. "All right, team," he said. 7 o'clock sharp. Let's give Memphis a show." He didn't realize that the show wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the kid he'd called a nobody. Would you have taken that stage after being humiliated in front of millions? Or would you have stayed silent and safe? As the red on-air light blinked to life, Elvis stepped into the booth. The crowd outside pressed their hands to the glass. The clock ticked 7. Then 7:01, Carson leaned into the mic and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a guest tonight." And as Elvis tuned his guitar, the city held its breath. CHQ Radio, January 9th, 1956. The red on-air light glowed against the glass like a warning. The room smelled of dust and cigarette smoke. Elvis stood just a few feet from the microphone, guitar slung low, thumb resting against the worn edge of the fretboard. Outside the booth, a crowd had gathered. Dozens of fans pressed against the window, their breath fogging the glass. Every face reflected the same question. Would he answer insult with music or walk away? Inside, Carson cleared his throat, trying to sound calm. "All right, Memphis," he began, voice slipping into his usual radio polish. "Last night, I might have said a few words about this young man, and tonight, he's here to prove me wrong, or right." He turned toward Elvis, forcing a smile. "You ready, kid?" Elvis gave a small nod. "Born ready, sir," then silence. A long, heavy pause. You could hear the faint buzz of the microphone, the shifting of Carson's chair, the soft murmur of the crowd outside. Elvis adjusted his strap and said into the mic, voice quiet but clear, "I hear some folks think I'm just another nobody. Well," he strummed once, the sound sharp and alive. "Let's see what a nobody sounds like." And just like that, the room transformed. The first chords of "That's All Right" filled the air, warm, raw, unfiltered. It wasn't the polished version from Sun Records. This one carried nerves, sweat, and soul. The kind that makes your chest ache. Carson sat frozen. Even the producer behind the glass forgot to breathe. Elvis's foot tapped against the floor, steady as a heartbeat. His voice rose and cracked, not perfectly, but beautifully. It was human. Real. Outside, the crowd began to move, their hands pressed harder to the glass, mouths open but silent. One young woman whispered, "He's doing it live. No band, no tricks." Halfway through the song, the switchboard started blinking. The operator shouted, "We've got calls coming in. Dozens, hundreds." Carson frowned. "They're for him?" "All of them," she said. "They won't stop." The sound engineer's hands shook as he pointed to the meters peaking red. "Phones are melting red!" But Elvis didn't stop. He leaned closer to the mic and let out a low, smooth note that made the entire room vibrate. The song ended with one long, trembling chord. And silence. Then the world exploded. Cheers from outside. Clapping. Shouting. The switchboard lights went wild. Carson removed his headphones slowly, staring at Elvis like he was seeing him for the first time. He tried to joke, but his voice cracked. "Guess the nobody just filled my phone lines." Elvis smiled, soft and polite. "Guess so." A fan pounded on the glass, yelling, "We love you, Elvis!" Carson swallowed hard and looked down at his notes, pretending to shuffle papers. But the truth was written all over his face. Shock, humility, and something like admiration. Elvis leaned forward and said gently, "Mr. Carson, thank you for having me. I hope tonight you heard something worth remembering." Carson blinked, speechless. For once, the man who lived by words had none. The sound engineer whispered, "Do you feel that? The whole building's vibrating." It wasn't the sound system. It was the city. Every diner, every bar, every parked car with a radio tuned to WCHQ, because, in that 3-minute song, a young man who'd been called a nobody became the voice of everybody who'd ever been dismissed, doubted, or told they weren't enough. Would you have forgiven your critic, or tried to crush him? Elvis didn't need revenge. He had rhythm, and as Carson reached out to shake his hand, the cameras in the lobby clicked, immortalizing the moment that would soon appear in every Memphis paper. What came next would turn that handshake into legend. By the time the last note faded from the radio booth, the city of Memphis had already changed. The red on-air light flickered out, but across town, the glow of jukeboxes, truck stops, and diners pulsed brighter than ever. It was as if every speaker in Tennessee had caught the same heartbeat. 18 p.m., January 9th, 1956. Inside a small diner on Beale Street, the cook stopped flipping burgers mid-air. The song had ended, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the music itself. Customers leaned closer to the radio, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak. Carson's voice finally returned, shaky but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we just heard the future of music." Outside the WCHQ building, the street was chaos. Cars honking, fans cheering, soldiers in uniform waving their hats. Some people cried, others just smiled, too stunned to talk. Reporters sprinted toward the station. One yelled, "What did he just do in there?" A fan shouted back, "He made the world listen." Inside, Carson sat in disbelief. For years, he'd filled dead air with fast talk and forced jokes. But now, the silence between songs felt sacred. He turned to his producer. "Play it again," he whispered. "We can't. It was live." Across the state, switchboards overloaded. WCHQ's lines rang for hours, operators scribbling down messages from listeners in Georgia, Alabama, even Texas. "Play that Presley boy again. Tell him he made my mama cry. I don't even like rock music, but that was something else." Elvis, unaware of the storm outside, sat quietly in the station's break room, sipping black coffee. His hands were still trembling slightly, but there was a calm in his eyes. Carson entered, hat in hand. For a long moment he said nothing, then quietly, "You just shut me up on my own show." Elvis smiled politely. "Wasn't trying to, sir. Just wanted the music to speak first." Carson nodded slowly, looking down. Guess it did. That line became the quote every paper would print the next day. By midnight, radio stations across the South were begging for a copy of the recording, but there wasn't one. WCHQ hadn't taped the segment. It existed only in the memories of those who heard it live, and that made it even more powerful. The next morning, the Memphis Press ran the headline, "Singer turns insult into iconic broadcast. Fans flood station." Elvis didn't buy the paper. He didn't have to. The looks on people's faces told him everything. Kids on street corners mimicked his stance. Shopkeepers hummed his melody. Even old church ladies nodded quietly when his name came up. He had done it. Without anger, without payback, just music. What would you have done standing there under those hot lights? Would you have tried to prove your worth? Or simply let your truth sing for you? That day, the entire South learned something. Sometimes, the quietest answer echoes the loudest. And while fans celebrated, one man wrestled with guilt. Tommy "Red" Carson couldn't shake the image of that handshake, the same hand he had mocked less than 24 hours earlier. So when Elvis prepared for his next concert at Ellis Auditorium, Carson made a decision. He would go, uninvited, because forgiveness might begin with music, but redemption needed a stage. January 11th, 1956, Ellis Auditorium, Memphis. The winter night crackled with anticipation. Nearly 5,000 people filled the hall, their cheers echoing off the curved ceiling. From the balcony to the stage lights, it felt less like a concert and more like a reckoning. Elvis stood backstage, adjusting the collar of his black jacket. He could hear the roar of the crowd chanting his name. The air vibrated with restless energy, excitement, pride, and something heavier, something like vindication. Then, through the maze of stagehands and instruments, he saw him, Tommy "Red" Carson, the radio DJ who'd called him a nobody just 3 nights earlier. Carson stood near the curtain, hat in hand, shoulders slumped. He looked smaller without the microphone, without the confidence that came with talking over other people's songs. The band froze. Colonel Parker frowned. "Elvis, you want me to have him removed?" Elvis shook his head. "No, sir. He can stay." Carson stepped forward. His voice was rough. "I came to apologize. In person." Elvis said nothing. He just studied the man. The same one whose words had once cut deep. For a few seconds, all you could hear was the murmur of the crowd outside. Finally, Elvis spoke. "If you mean it, you'll have a chance to say it where it matters." Carson blinked. "You mean out there? In front of all them?" Elvis nodded. "That's where you said the first part." Carson hesitated, eyes darting to the stage. His hands shook slightly as he realized what the young singer was asking. Not revenge, but courage. A few minutes later, the lights dimmed. The crowd erupted as Elvis walked out, waving once before raising a hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the mic, his southern drawl gentle. "Before we start, I've got someone special here tonight." A murmur swept through the hall. Then, to everyone's surprise, Carson stepped onto the stage. The man who'd mocked him now stood beside him, under the same spotlight. Carson took a deep breath, his voice trembling as it echoed across the hall. "I said something on the radio this week I wish I could take back. I called this man a nobody, but tonight I heard a voice that belongs to everybody." The crowd gasped, then roared. Applause thundered through the auditorium, shaking the walls. Some stood, others cried. Elvis reached out his hand. For a moment, Carson just stared at it, then took it. The handshake was simple, quiet, but it hit harder than any song. Reporters scribbled wildly in their notepads. Flashbulbs went off like fireworks, and somewhere in the crowd, a young fan whispered, "That's what respect looks like." Elvis leaned into the mic, smiling softly. "Thank you, Mr. Carson. Now let's make some noise worth remembering." The band kicked in with blue suede shoes. The hall exploded. But while the music shook the air, everyone's eyes were still on that handshake, the one that turned bitterness into redemption. Because in that moment, the king of rock and the man who doubted him became proof of something bigger, that humility can be louder than hate. What would you have done if your biggest critic showed up in front of thousands? Would you humiliate him or hand him a microphone? That night, Elvis chose forgiveness and changed more than a song. He changed a man. Backstage after the show, the air still hummed with the echo of cheers. The walls vibrated faintly, as if the applause hadn't stopped. It had just moved inside people's chests. Elvis sat on a wooden chair, head bowed, hands clasped. His knuckles were still warm from the handshake. Around him, the band packed up instruments, laughing and shouting about the night's success. But Elvis stayed quiet. Then a soft knock. Carson stepped into the room, holding his hat nervously against his chest. The arrogance that once filled every word was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar: humility. He said, "I don't deserve the kindness you showed out there." Elvis looked up, eyes gentle but steady. "Everyone deserves a second verse, Mr. Carson, even the ones who start on the wrong note." Carson nodded, almost embarrassed. "You could have embarrassed me back there. You could have ruined me." Elvis leaned forward. "Wouldn't have fixed a thing. The world's got enough people breaking each other down. I'd rather build something." The DJ's throat tightened. He reached into his pocket and handed Elvis a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something on the drive here. I don't expect you to keep it." Elvis opened it slowly. The handwriting was shaky but sincere. "Never call anyone a nobody again." For a long time, Elvis said nothing. Then he smiled faintly and folded the note in half, slipping it into the back cover of his Bible. "Then we'll call that a promise," he said softly. The two men shook hands again. Not for cameras this time, but for understanding. The next morning the story exploded. Newspapers across the South printed the photo of the handshake with headlines like, "DJ eats his words, Presley answers with grace." But the real story wasn't in print. It was in what followed. A week later, Billboard magazine ran a small quote from Elvis's interview after the show. "You can sing louder than anger if you mean what you say." That single line became a motto, painted on fan club banners, written on guitar cases, even carved into army lockers years later when he was drafted. For thousands of fans, it wasn't just about a singer anymore. It was about dignity, about turning insult into inspiration. A Memphis schoolteacher later said her students repeated that line during assemblies. "Never call anyone a nobody." Carson went on to keep his promise. He stayed on the air for decades, and every year on January 9th, he replayed Elvis's music for a full hour. No ads, no interruptions, just the voice that once humbled him. What would the world sound like if more people answered hate with grace? Would we remember noise or harmony? That whisper in a crowded backstage room became a creed, a quiet truth that still echoes wherever someone chooses kindness over pride. And for Elvis, that folded note would stay tucked inside his Bible for the rest of his life. A reminder that greatness doesn't just come from talent, it comes from mercy. 50 years later, the hiss of old tape filled a studio once more. WCHQ Radio, January 9th, 2006. A younger DJ adjusted the dials, carefully threading a reel labelled in fading pencil. Presley Live Segment, 1956. The recording crackled to life, faint static, then that unmistakable drawl. Smooth, young, fearless. I hear some folks think I'm just another nobody. The rest was history. Across Memphis, people tuned in again, just as they had half a century before. Some listened from cars, others from hospital rooms, nursing homes, small diners that still kept their radios near the counter. And for 3 minutes time folded. The same song that once turned an insult into a legend played again. Raw, imperfect, eternal. When it ended, the DJ spoke softly. 50 years ago today, Elvis Presley proved that dignity sings louder than pride. Outside the studio, visitors gathered by a bronze plaque mounted on the wall. The engraving read, January 9th, 1956, the day a nobody became everybody. Below it sat Carson's old broadcast microphone, sealed in glass. The small plate beneath it read, "From Tommy Red Carson, thank you for forgiving me." People left flowers. Some left handwritten notes. One said, "Thank you for reminding us that kindness never goes out of style. Even after all the fame, the movies, and the glittering stages, that radio moment, that single act of grace, remained one of the truest things ever told about Elvis Presley. Because legacy isn't built on applause, it's built on choices. The ones no one forces you to make, the ones that echo when the music stops. Would you have handled hate with silence, or turned it into a song the world couldn't forget? The tape ended with soft static, that ghostly sound of history breathing. And as it faded, a single voice remained, Elvis's voice. Calm, certain. "You can't call anyone a nobody," he said, his words barely above a whisper, "because everyone's got a song." And that was the last thing on the recording, a legend's final note, not sung, but spoken. He could have shouted back. He could have humiliated the man who mocked him, but instead, Elvis Presley chose grace, and in doing so, rewrote what power sounds like. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Real strength isn't about being loud. It's about being kind when you could have been cruel.